Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session of the Anglo-Turkish Society. My name is David Shankland. I'm the chair of the society, and I don't think I have any announcements today, except to say preparations are in place for our annual Christmas lunch at the Athenaeum Club. And so you should start saving now because the prices have gone up again. But anyway, with enough notice, I'm sure people will manage. And it's probably going to be Thursday, the 12th of December. It will be a dinner rather than a lunch this time. So there we are, just a bit of forward notice for that. We're very, very pleased to welcome Eugene Rogan today. Of course, a very, very well-known historian and scholar. And he's going to be talking about his recent book, The Damascus Events, the 1860 Massacre and the Destruction of the Old Ottoman World, which is a wonderfully ambiguous title. It really is. The more I think about it, the more I find it evocative. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us. And I've looked at the book a little bit already, and I can tell you that it's a wonderful read with lots of stuff in it about the Druze and so on, but I shall have to read the book for the same time. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I assume I don't need to unmute myself to start speaking. Jan Owl is going to do the duty.
Everything's fine. Carry on.
David, Craig, guest, wonderful to be with you and delighted to have this chance to talk about my new book with the Anglo-Turkish Society. It's been a 35-year project to bring to fruition. So it's one of those academic deadlines that I kept missing and missing and missing. But it is out, and so I'm glad to give it a shout. For our talk today, I thought I'd focus on the good news side of the book. A lot of the book, the first half of the book, is trying to explain how it is that a society breaks down to the point of reaching a kind of genocidal moment, which is how I describe the events that take place in Damascus in the summer of 1860. And then you have a chapter in the dead center of the book, which just documents day by day what happens during the Damascus events. So it starts rather badly, but keep reading, because the second half of the book is really focusing on the ways that the Ottoman authorities succeeded in the very sensitive and delicate task of rebuilding Damascus and reintegrating the Christian communities. And the success of their efforts is demonstrated, in my view, as the historian looking back on these times, by the way that by the late 1880s, you could really say that Damascus had moved beyond the crisis of 1860 and had achieved a degree of integration in the communities that meant that Damascus was never to be marked by a sectarian legacy from its 1860 events. And in that sense, a very real distinction could be drawn between the experience of Damascus in its 1860 events and those in Mount Lebanon. Those in Mount Lebanon. The contrast there, where in Mount Lebanon, very similar time, the outbreak of communal violence was to leave a sectarian legacy that was to shape government in Lebanon from late Ottoman times down to the present day. It's a defining feature of their confessional political system. That was not the case with Damascus. And if you like, I would say that the 1860 events are squarely framed within the Ottoman Tanzimat, the era of reforms. And if, in a sense, the 1860 events were in no small part a consequence of the Ottoman reforms, I would also argue that the Reconstruction and the success of Reconstruction can also be credited to the Ottoman reforms. Here, we'll be moving between reforms of 1856, which proved very destabilizing to society, and then look at reforms after 1865, where you have provincial reforms that will provide a platform for a meaningful Reconstruction project. So if the Tanzimat were to some extent responsible for destabilizing society to the point at which you witnessed a massacre, I would argue that it was an Ottoman solution through the framework of the Tanzimat that was going to provide pathway for reconstruction and reintegration. That was, in the event, 100% successful. So, to begin, I think I do have to start a little bit by setting out what happened in 1860, so that you have a background for understanding Reconstruction. If we didn't have the terrible massacre, there would be no point to this lecture. Basically, in answering everyone's first question, why did the Muslims of Damascus rise up to kill the Christians of Damascus? The early chapters of the book will trace the ways that changes in the economy and society of Damascus in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s were to lead to a crisis between relations between communities. Communities that in 1830 had lived completely in harmony in a social hierarchy in which the Sunni Muslim majority was at the top of the pinnacle, and in which the Christian and Jewish communities were respected and protected, but distinctly second-class citizens. There were restrictions on how they behaved, really defined a hierarchy within the society of Damascus. And so long as all communities lived within those social structures, then it was a society in which Muslim, Christian, and Jew lived next to each other, traded with each other in the marketplaces, went to each other's celebrations, knew each other socially. So it's quite an important breakdown that takes place in the following years. The economic changes have to do with the growing trade with Europe beginning to reach Damascus. Here, the dumping of industrial products from the mills of Lancashire or Lyon into the marketplaces of Damascus not only competed for the sale of cloth, but of course undermined the very important textile industry. That was one of Damascus's most important, particularly in cottons, silks, and those fusions of cotton and silk. So as the steamships of the 1840s and 50s began to ply regular courses back and forth across the Mediterranean, and as they grew larger, their holds carrying more, they were really beginning to influence the markets of Damascus, not just in what they deposited of industrial goods, but in trying to fill their holds with primary products. So cotton fiber, silk, also wool, to take back to France, Italy, Britain, and in this way, really causing a double bind on the local economy of Damascus. The only people really benefiting from that were the Christian merchants who worked with the European trading houses and were benefiting from the kind of revenue stream that growing trade with Europe generated. So you see an area in which a distinct community, the Christians in particular, benefit from this growing trade to the detriment of the Muslim majority. There were also important changes taking place in the politics of the city. Following the Egyptian occupation in the 1830s, you begin to see the first European consuls posted to Damascus. As they come, they bring with them all of the privileges of the extraterritorial treaties of the capitulations, which meant they enjoyed privileges on taxation, exemption from Ottoman legal proceedings. They would be tried only by the laws of their own countries. It's one thing for, let us say, the British and French expatriates who come to the consulates in Damascus, but it's quite another when they took advantage of one of their privileges of the capitulation to hire local people to serve as kabosses, as dragomans or terjemans, to serve the sort of clerical functions of these consulates. And each one of the local people recruited to serve in the consulates also benefited through the beirats they received, or they received, from tax breaks and extraterritorial legal privileges that were associated only with foreigners. And thereby, again, benefiting from this whole new change and a whole new elite coming to Damascus through these consuls, exercising power on the governor, through the governor on the city. That was to prove a real challenge in balancing the politics of Damascus, the hierarchies of Damascus. To the extent that the Ottomans of Damascus looked to anyone to protect them from these changes, the Damascene Muslim elites looked to the Sultan's government. Sultan was their caliph. He was there to uphold the Fi order. And yet, the Sultan was to prove, in many ways, the greatest traitor or betrayer of their interests when his government passed legislation in 1856 conferring legal equality on all communities of the Ottoman Empire. So suddenly, Jews and Christians were on an equal legal footing with Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, which was in itself such a massive change to be imposed by fiat without any consultation, no advanced warning. And it wasn't done, if you like, for domestic Ottoman reasons. It was done entirely to try and prevent European powers from using that very pernicious politics of protection, in which France served as the protector state of all the Catholic communities in the Ottoman Empire, Russia, the protector of all Orthodox communities. The British got a toehold through the Jewish community, through the Druze community, through a very small Protestant community, almost too small to mention. So the British were not big players in the patronage politics. But nonetheless, these politics of foreign intervention on behalf of local religious communities had grown so contentious that by the 1850s, you can trace the origins of the Crimean War to disputes over the holy places in Palestine that led to the breakdown of relations between the Russians and the French, and to a Russo-Turkish war foreseeing the Anglo-French intervention that came to be known as the Crimean War. This is not a stretch of the imagination. This is how dangerous such intervention politics could be. And so the court's decision on the eve of the Paris conference, in which the disputing parties signed the peace to end the Crimean War, and where the Ottomans were making their bid to be admitted to the concert of Europe as a way of protecting their interests against the other powers of Europe, the Sultan's government passed legislation conferring total legal equality. It's Islahat Fermanı of 1856, and it was to prove an absolute earthquake in terms of Ottoman Muslim opinion, because for the first time in the reforms, the Sultan's government arrogated on itself the authority to contradict not just Sharia, but God's pure word of the Quran. The Quran distinguishes in many very specific ways distinctions between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. To say they're all the same before the law isn't just going against legal tradition, it's contradicting them. And here again, I don't wish to overstate the point in some sort of Orientalist way, but I think it is a very important reason for Sunni resistance to this change that was imposed on them by fiat, and they found to be totally destabilizing to them. So, if you could imagine a world in which minority communities were benefiting from such economic changes that benefited them at the expense of the majority community, and from the kind of political changes that the presence of foreign consuls gave to a growing number of Christians in particular, and then you add to that the legal changes brought about in 1856 by the reform decree of the Tanzimat. The only way you could imagine such changes not leading to an explosive situation would have been if the beneficiary communities, and particularly the Christians, had accepted these changes without rocking the boat. I'm afraid that was not the space that Syrian Christians were inhabiting in the 1850s, for with each gain in wealth, in social power, and in legal status, they grew increasingly assertive. There's no other way to put it. And many of the Muslim notables of Damascus, in their own writings from the time, capture a growing resentment at the ways in which the Christians of Damascus no longer were willing to live by the old rules, where if a Muslim insulted a Christian, the Christian would return the insult twice as strong. If a Muslim struck a Christian, the Christian would strike back twice. There was a new assertiveness, was challenging the social hierarchies that were of century standing, and was something that was giving rise to more than just hostility, more than just resentment. It was giving rise to a kind of murderous tension between the communities. So this is where I think there's relevance to the events in neighboring Mount Lebanon. What happens in Mount Lebanon in May or June of 1860 is, in its roots, very different from the violence of Damascus. Firstly, the communities involved were totally different. The violence in Mount Lebanon was primarily between the Druze community, an esoteric religious community that drew its origins from the Ottoman Empire, but followers of the Caliphate Hakam bi Amrillah, a group of its followers began to espouse unorthodox beliefs that had them persecuted in Cairo. They took flight, they settled in the highlands of Lebanon, where they were at liberty to develop their own religious beliefs until there was really no resemblance between the faith of the Druze and Shia Islam from which they spread. In that same geography, you had one of the many small Christian offshoots of Orthodox Christianity, the Maronite Church, who, persecuted for their differences, also taken to the highlands of Lebanon. And in the course of the 12th, 13th century, right through to the 18th century, you could talk about Maronites and Druze forging a political structure that was not confessional in its demise. It's not as though it was the Druze lording it over the Maronites. Rather, it was a very rigid pyramid with the princely families, of which there were 4 or 5, Druze, at the top of it. And the next layer down was the aristocracy of the sheikhs and muqaddams. And here again, you have Maronite and Druze families at that aristocratic level, lordly level. And then the 90%, the rest of the population, farmers and artisans, were equally divided between Druze and Maronites. So you didn't have, if you like, a confessional split, you had a class structure. And if we talk about this structure in terms more familiar to Europeans, it's usually described in terms of being a sort of feudal structure. Liege lords with large terrain, with the cultivators and the producers acting as their liegemen and their serfs. So this was, if you like, the political order that coming into the 19th century would face tremendous change with the Egyptian occupation, the 1830s, all of Greater Syria, Mount Lebanon, Damascus, Aleppo, in which they introduced serious changes and reforms to the way in which Syria is governed, turning the Maronites who cooperated with the Egyptians against the Druze who resisted and took flight to Jebel Haran, now known as Jebel Druze, the highlands to the southeast of Damascus, where Syrian Druze now claim their home. This is when the beginnings of the Druze community of that highland can be traced. And as the Druze fled Mount Lebanon for Jebel Haran, the Maronites absorbed their lands, absorbed their titles, absorbed their rights. The returning Druze, after the Egyptian withdrawal, wanted to reclaim their status, their lands. Found great resistance, not just from the Maronite community, but from the ruling princes of the Shihabi family. And so this creates a very strong antagonism between the Druze, largely outnumbered by the Maronites and other Christian communities. By the time you reach the 1850s, the Druze counted a ratio of fighting men, about 1 to 4 Druze to Christians. So the Druze really were the compact minority in Mount Lebanon, facing very assertive Christian community in the mountain, openly talking about expelling the Druze once and for all to claim all of Mount Lebanon as a Christian state or a Christian territory. The Druze, faced with an existential threat to their lands and their possessions and their position, took radical action. And princes, sheikhs, and peasants band together, fighting men in arms. And in the course of May and June of 1860, they take decisive action, striking without warning Christian towns and mixed towns in such places as Jazin, or Deir el-Qamar, or Hasbaya, or Rashea, culminating in the largely Greek Catholic town of Zahmi, overlooking the Bekaa Valley. Using guile, using treachery, using whatever it took, they could not afford to lose a single battle. The Druze struck with such violence that in the course of a few weeks, no less than 11,000 Christian, mostly men of fighting age, were massacred in towns where eyewitnesses described the streets literally flowing with blood. To different communities, different triggers for conflict, but for the Sunni Muslim majority in Damascus who had come to identify their own Christian problem for the reasons I just outlined, there was a growing sense of excitement about what the Druze were doing in Mount Lebanon, as if The Druze, having identified their Christian problems, found a solution in extermination. And increasingly, Muslims in Damascus began to think in the same terms. If we can be rid of Christians, our lives will go back to being what they were. And Druze methods seem to work. The moment you begin harboring such thoughts for communities in your city, it seems that you begin to suffer a kind of guilty fear that they might have the same intentions towards you. And my contemporary sources provide ample examples of wild rumors circulating among the Muslims of Damascus in the summer of 1860 that the Christian households of the city were hiding armed men who were waiting to rise up, ideally when the Muslims were defenseless and fair, to massacre them all. Indeed, there were rumors of such massacres taking place while Muslims were at prayer in Jerusalem. All quite false. And some of my Christian sources actively going among their Muslim friends to try and convince them that there was no truth to these wild rumors. But fact is irrelevant when it comes to the realm of rumors. It's what people believe. And if you're thinking murderous thoughts towards the Christians, you're going to be very ready to believe that the Christians have it in for you too. So that was the febrile atmosphere, if you like, in the summer of 1860. That was to lead to what I would describe again as a genocidal moment, where having identified the target community as an existential crisis, the solution, the reasonable solution, is extermination. And of course, you have to put yourself into what that actually means. What would it take for you yourself? Because trust me, the people in Damascus were not so different from you and me. We're not better than them. What is it that takes a human society to the point where it would seem reasonable to take out the kitchen knives? That's what happens. In July of 1860, when a group of Muslim pranksters threw chalk in the streets of the Christian quarter, thereby forcing Christians to defile the symbol of their religion by walking on the crosses, Christian leaders went to complain to the governor, who overreacted, slapped a group of Muslim youths, chosen, it seems, fairly arbitrarily, not really because they were guilty of anything, slapped them in manacles, gave them a broom, and sent them to sweep the Christian quarters, which again to us in 2024 sounds like a fairly reasonable penalty or punishment. But as I give in anecdotes earlier in the book, this idea of being sent in chain gangs to sweep streets was the punishment of common criminals. And for the Muslim community at this time of heightened anxiety, heightened anger, deep hatred, to see their youth being paraded through the streets in manacles with brooms to sweep the Christian quarters like common criminals was the swamp. Shopkeepers closed their shutters. A mob formed. And literally within an hour, you had masses of people descending on the Christian, making clear their intentions, which, as everyone quoted them, was to rob, to murder, and to burn. These are the Damascus. They go on for about 8 days. And in the course of those 8 days, you're left in no doubt that the intention was once and for all to exterminate the Christians of Damascus, to eliminate every trace of their presence by literally robbing and getting down to the last window frame and nail of their houses, and then setting on fire the remainder, doing the same to their shops. But for the intervention of key Muslim notables from Damascus, appalled by the violence unleashed on their Christian neighbors, who took the great risk of protecting Christian neighbors in their own homes. And here, the most famous instance is the Emir Abdul Qadir, celebrated for his role in fighting against the French occupation of Algeria, who, after his capture by the French in 1847, went into exile in the Ottoman Empire and ultimately settled in Damascus, where he became one of the leading Muslim notables of the state. Abdul Qadir attracted to Damascus by his very presence a large group of veterans of the Algerian War who didn't want to live under French occupation. So he was actually able to arm about 1,200 Algerian veterans who were to give him a militia that allowed him to intervene in the violence, to rescue thousands of Christians away from the quarters where they were the target of the mob, to the safety of his house, British consulate, and ultimately to the citadel of Damascus, where they were in very tense circumstances to see out the remainder of the week of violence until finally law and order would be restored. So in the course of the mob violence, no fewer than 5,000 people. Of the 5,000, about 2,500 were native to Damascus, so Damascene Christians. The other 2,500 were survivors of atrocity in other nearby towns and cities who had come to Damascus seeking refuge from the violence. Were creatures they were to be caught up once again in, a murderous pogrom. So about 2,500 refugees alongside the 2,500 Damascene Christians. By local estimates, no less than 1,500 houses were destroyed. But destroyed. I mean, absolutely gutted, burned. The photographs that survive from 1862 show Christian quarters still rather like pictures of Dresden after the in just walls, stones. The destruction was complete. The same thing happens to hundreds of shops because of the way Christian shops were interspersed with Muslim shops. They weren't torched in the same way, but absolutely stripped of all of their, valuable objects and gutted. And workshops, looms, factories, the whole of the kind of Christian economy of Damascus inside the wall. I should make a very brief distinction here, because of course you have the southern quarters of the Maidan going down toward the Rogan region, which is more of a working class neighborhood, in which no violence was done to the Christian communities at all. But many of the men of the Maidan were seen rampaging through the Christian quarters inside the city walls. So theirs was a mixed record of protecting the Christians in their own neighborhood, but attacking opportunistically Christian neighborhoods inside the walls of Damascus. Terrible violence, yet, thanks to the intervention of Muslim notables, Abdul Qadir or Algerian, about 85% of the Christian population of Damascus survives. This is a good outcome. If you are going to face a terrible massacre in which the mob is calling for the extermination of all the Christians, the survival of 85% is a good outcome. But it left the Ottoman government having to provide everything to 85% of the Christians of Damascus, who had literally fled with the clothes on their back and lost everything else. Their money, their property, their work tools, everything. So that, by way of long introduction, will give you some sense of what the challenges facing the Ottoman authorities to rebuild the city in the aftermath of the 1860 events. And it's to that happier part of the story we turn now. Eight days of street violence, of mob violence. The first imperative of the Ottoman state had to be reestablishing law and order. The governor of Damascus, who was himself, in the eyes of many contemporaries, largely responsible for the unfolding of events, his failures to take preventative action, and indeed some of the actions he took that seemed provocative, were judged by the Ottoman state to demonstrate his guilt, and he would subsequently be executed in Damascus for his own rule. But the governor was paralyzed by the unfolding of events, and he remained closed within his palace, not daring to go out on the street, afraid of the mob. But they were a fearsome mob. The streets of Damascus were literally crawling with people who were themselves murderers, robbers, and arsonists. These are not people that you would mix with comfortably, and they were drunk with the violence that they had been engaging in for 8 days. And they were unrepentant, And they showed no respect to any authority because none had imposed on them when they were at the height of their madness. So it's only with the arrival of the minister plenipotentiary dispatched from Istanbul, Fuad Pasha. He was the foreign secretary of the Ottoman Empire. He was one of the leading reformers of the Tanzimat era. He was actually one of the authors of the 1856 decree, that controversial Islahat Fermanı, that conferred legal equality on Christians and Jews with Muslims. So he has, if you like, a stake in the very underlying causes of this turmoil. And he fears that the agenda of reform is suffering a setback. He also fears that if the Ottomans don't demonstrate that they're capable of restoring order, control over Damascus, that the violence against Christians will serve as a pretext for a European intervention that could even cost Ottoman sovereignty in Syria. They were particularly concerned about French intentions. France had made very clear its interest in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Napoleon III reacts on learning of the violence by dispatching an expeditionary force of 6,000 French soldiers to the shores of Lebanon. So Fuad has got to try and demonstrate to people of Damascus, as well as to the European powers, that the Ottoman state is back, and they are in a position to restore law and order as it is known. But how do you bring such an unruly mob back under control? Well, the first thing that it involved was some exemplary punishment. And you have the sense from reading Fuad's reports, and the Ottoman archives have extensive reports that Fuad was filing back to Istanbul and provide really some of the best material for this period in writing of the book. He assembles an extraordinary tribunal. He forces the notables of Damascus to cooperate with him in denouncing each other. His argument is basically, you, the notables, are the governing council of Damascus. You are the men of the Mejlis. The Mejlis is, of course, the governing council. You failed in your responsibilities to allow the events to run out of control in this way. Either you tell us who did it, or you will, in a sense, wear the noose yourself. You will take the responsibility and you will suffer the consequences. So after much pressure, they begin to reveal the names of individuals known to have taken part in the murder and the plunder in the arson. And after the tribunal meets for 2 or 3 weeks, we begin to get sentences passed. And in the middle of the night, in the summer of 1860, some 57 notables to middle-ranking Muslim figures from the city of Damascus were taken to places near where they were accused of their crimes and hanged. So that Damascenes, who did not hear these death rattles just outside their door, awoke to horror. Again, one of my leading witnesses, Mikhail Mishaka, describes coming out of his house hearing a commotion, and is face to face with one of those who was involved in attacking him in the massacres, that he survives. And the shock of seeing someone of high standing in the city hanging from a street corner was something which certainly gave people a sense of fear of the Ottoman state, but also fear of what kind of resentments that summary justice might bring onto the heads of the surviving Christians of Damascus. Later that same day as the hangings, 110 policemen and irregular soldiers, Zaptier and Bashabazouk, were taken to a field near the administrative center of Damascus, where 800 soldiers were each given 1 bullet and told to fire on the mass of 110. It was carnage. It was shocking violence. Now, all this happens within 24 hours. But the state was trying to send a clear message that they would broach no resistance to law and order, that the respect for the Ottoman state would be reimposed, and they would not hesitate. They take it, as I said before, to the point of putting on trial Ahmed Pasha, the former governor of Damascus, held responsible for the violence, and they execute him, as well as 2 kaymakams from townships in the southern reaches of the province around Hasbeya and Rashea, who were also accused of complicity in the unfolding of violence. So right to the highest level, to the level of, Mutasaddifs and Apachas, they were willing to execute. On top of that, there were many more that were arrested. Literally thousands of Muslims are being arrested in that summer of 1860. But they couldn't get testimony against all of them. So many were exiled. Others were sent to prison in Famagusta in Cyprus. Some were sent into Anatolia. Young men presumed to have been involved, even if they couldn't find guilt. You couldn't take legal proceedings against them, but you could conscript them into the Sultan's army. Thousands of young Christian men who had never before served in Ottoman uniforms were now conscripted into the army. So you see this assault on the Muslim elite of Damascus and right down to the middle levels of the city's communities being targeted for execution, for imprisonment, for exile, for conscription. It did reestablish fear of the Ottoman state and respect for the law, but at a price, because all of this harm done to the Muslim community was done on behalf of the Christians. And it was once again a source of tension that what was a gain for the Christians, or what was a loss for the Muslims, was to benefit the Christians. And you have terrible fear among the Christian communities of Damascus yet again, that there's going to be another wave of massacre. We have a butcher going rogue and putting poison in meat that he sells to Christians. And when one or two of them die of it, he's arrested and hanged for his crimes. But it just, those sorts of events, that just played on people's nerves at the aftermath. And again, what's wonderful about the source material I found for my book is we really get this kind of gritty detail of day-to-day events and what was happening at the street level. Fantastic material. So yes, the first stage is going to be law and order. Really, that's where the Ottomans focused their efforts in the first year after the events. From sort of July of 1860 right through to the spring of 1861. But of course, law and order does not provide houses or work for the Christian communities. You actually have to find a way to help restore to the Christians what they lost in the events. So there had to be a whole process of working out how to indemnify the Christians for their losses. And here we had councils created to gather together the evidence. Very hard to do for people who, having lost everything, how do you prove that I had 20,000 piastres under my mattress at home? How do you prove that I had carpets or that I had books worth 30,000 piastres? So they would come, make their claims, identify all the objects they had in their household, and provide character witnesses to try and confirm what they had. The Ottomans clearly suspected that the Christians were inflating their claims. And no doubt the Christians were clearly expecting that the Ottomans would discount whatever claim they made. So you have a whole process put in place to try and work out how to indemnify the Christians. The genius of Fuad, still working in Damascus, is that he recruits Muslim and Jewish notables to serve on these indemnity boards, because he knows that it's going to be Muslims and Jews who are going to be the ones hit on for the money to pay for the indemnity for the Christian victims, the Christian survivors. So in a sense, gaining the seal of approval from the target communities who would be asked to pay for these indemnities eventually. And at the end of the process, the government literally passed an award decision on each and every Christian household's claim to the city of Damascus and issued them with bonds with a 4-phase repayment schedule. The first in cash. You had to demonstrate that you were using that cash to rebuild in Damascus, since so many of the survivors had fled to Beirut or other cities and didn't want to return to Damascus. Damascus was not going to give you money for your losses if you weren't going to spend it on rebuilding in Damascus. The second tranche of payments and indemnities would be in wood, just to reinforce that you're using the indemnity to rebuild. And to do this, a way of, if you like, making free money, they call for the chopping down of tens of thousands of trees from the lush forests and arbors surrounding the city of Damascus. They do a census of trees and they have them all chopped down. And your second level of payments was going to be in wood. which is, of course, what everyone needed for building the structures and the roofs of their houses. And then the third and fourth, and you had to be an optimist to believe you'd get a fourth, was all to be in cash to allow you the money to finish up. So all that process, all that bureaucracy put in place before Fuad was to come to the end of his 18-month mission in Damascus. And then he left it to his successors, men appointed to be, Vali or governor over Damascus, not a minister plenipotentiary to the Syrian of ISIS, like Fuad. He's called back to Istanbul, where he's made Grand Vizier. And, we'll come back to him in a moment. So we've worked out restoring law and order, and then how to repay the Christians for what they've lost. The third is you actually have to raise the money to pay them. We know that the Ottoman state did not have the disposable to pay for the reconstruction of Damascus. In the 1860s already, they're getting into the deadly cycle of borrowing for their own development needs in the reform era. That will ultimately lead to bankruptcy in 1875. They're not in bankruptcy yet, but they are borrowing. So there's no surplus to pay for the tragedy of Damascus. Ultimately, the money was going to have to come from Syria itself. And so here we see local sources being called upon, but how much could you levy from the Muslims and Jews of Damascus? The idea was you wouldn't tax the Christians as the victims. So it was all the non-Christians who would be taxed. Well, if you look at the estimates, one of our local sources estimates, again, the figures in the book, if I misspoke, you can correct me, that the total damage done in the course of the events was something in the range of about 250 million piastres. The European commissioners who came to intervene and guide the Ottomans in their handling of the post-crisis, they put a bid of a minimum of about 125 million piastres necessary to indemnify the Christians. The Ottoman government said, yes, we understand, but we don't think we can get more than 90. And in the end, the indemnity plan that the province puts into play targets 45 million. I think at the end, they were able to raise no more than 25. But again, it's coming from people who are suffering the economic consequences of the shutting down of Damascus. They canceled the pilgrimage caravan. The traditional sources of funding to Damascus were gone. The economy had literally ground to a halt. So the idea that you were going to tax the Muslim and Jewish communities when they weren't feeling particularly flush in the first place meant that you were really trying to squeeze blood from a stone. Bad metaphor for post-violent Damascus, but bear with it. And that they were going to once again engender tremendous resistance. But the taxes being imposed would benefit the Christians at the expense of Muslims. And once again, you have a wave panic sweeping the Christian community, threats of a new massacre from the Muslim community in Damascus. So these are all measures necessary to take to try and rebuild, but they come at a heavy price. And it's not improving communal relations in the slightest. But it was necessary if you were to provide the funding to enable the Christians to rebuild their homes and to secure the tools of their trade, that they would once again have dignified shelter and be able to go back to work. That process takes right up until about 1864. My main source, Mikhail Mishaka, writes a report to his consul general in Beirut at the end of 1864 and says, Reconstruction is complete. The Christians have rebuilt their houses. But they've done it on the cheap. The houses don't look like what they looked before the violence. Houses that were described as just some of the most beautiful in the Ottoman Empire, with courtyard gardens, with fruit trees, running water everywhere, mother of pearl, inlaid stone, pastework, colored glass. The houses of Damascus were in many ways the greatest treasure of Damascus. What the Christians were able to rebuild was a roof over your head, but it was camping more than it was luxury. And those quarters suffered from what all cities that have known urban poverty suffered. So I have reports of gang violence. You have gangs emerging. trying to extort money by illegal means where you can't earn an honest living. We have reports of prostitution, which is again one of those features common to all cities where you have quarters that have been reduced to destitution. In other words, you might say Damascus Christian quarters were reconstructed, but they were still very poor. And in that poverty, you were breeding great dangers. So it wasn't really a place where you could leave the reconstruction project and say mission accomplished. But let me take you back to Istanbul, where Fuad Pasha is still serving as Grand Vizier in 1864. And he never really forgets about his experiences in Damascus or in Beirut. And he recognizes that one of the fundamental ills, the provincial level, is the irregularity of governance. This is a very boring reform to describe in a lecture like this. But he convenes to Istanbul one of the greatest speakers of the Tanzimat, Midhat Pasha. Midhat, long experience in a region with equal if not worse communal violence, the Balkans. And these two great reformers put their heads together and try and rethink the structuring of Ottoman provincial government, creating a rational pyramid structure with clear lines of authority from the Vali to Mutasaddis over sub-provincial levels to Kaymakams in charge of police. And then under them, you have sort of clusters of villages, districts that create this kind of very regular pyramid. But what's more important for our story is that they decided to cobble provinces together into super provinces to create a different kind of revenue stream. And the first place they test this new 1864 provincial reform is in the Balkans, in what they call the Danube province, Tuna. And in this Danube province, where Midhat himself goes to be governor, they're able to take 3 provinces and concentrate all the tax revenues of those provinces in one governor's hands to allow for kind of rational planning to use that wealth to lay the foundations through infrastructure development or generating a new level. Basically, you need a lot of money if you wish to rebuild divided societies into prosperous ones. And after 9 months of the Tuna Vilayeti experiment, the next example tried was Syria, where the government decreed the union of the province of Beirut, Sidon as it was then known, Jerusalem, and Damascus into a new province called Suriye, Syria. Sets off a bit of a bidding war between Beirut and Damascus over which city would have the privilege of serving as the capital of this super province. But Fuad knew very well his intention was to concentrate the decision-making power in Damascus to complete the process of reconstruction. The revenues of Damascus increased about 5-fold by local contemporary estimates. So 5 times the revenues. You can't spend it all in Damascus. You have to make an equitable distribution of investment in Beirut as well as in Jerusalem. But the very fact that the money is now passing through the treasury of Damascus gave Damascene governors control over far more by way of financial resources, and what follows can only be described as a spending spree. The governors of Damascus spent on road infrastructure. You look at the time it took to cover the terrain in 1860. It was a 2-day trip from Beirut to Damascus. One of the first roads created, actually before this 1865 reform, was the Beirut to Damascus highway, and it reduces the travel time to about 9 hours, which is convenient for travelers, but it's everything for the movement of goods and services. And so on the experience of the Beirut to Damascus road, the Ottomans begin to lay roads linking the major towns of Syria, which is something that's going to prove a great stimulus to trade right through the province. And alongside that, telegraph. The telegraph made its entry in the late 1850s, early 1860s into Syria, and it becomes a means for the rapid communication used by, again, the merchant community to know how to price their goods in keeping with what the world market was doing. So you have this kind of linkage going on through roads and communications. And markets are at the heart of it. And this is a time of great investment in the markets of Damascus. Some of the largest, most modern markets of the city were built at this time. If you think of the street called Straight, which was a commercial thoroughfare leading from the southwest to the southeast of Damascus, ending in Bab Shapni, the Christian corner of Bab Shapni, 600 meters of that road becomes a vaulted gallery on the model of European gallery shopping that was 2 stories tall on a widened street that could accommodate two-way wheeled traffic for the first time. So beautiful, modern, luxurious, spacious, covered markets. Souk Hamidiyya from the 1880s, another major development that is probably the first stop of all tourists to Damascus, at least back in days when there were tourists to Damascus. And all these are the kinds of market developments where the city could see its commercial infrastructure giving the city a whole new economic lease. The death of the markets that followed the 1860 events had led to a renaissance. They were bigger and better than ever before. And at the same time, you have a spread of government offices that accompanies the growth of this administrative structure. And that means massive expansion of government buildings. Very good for the construction industry and for all the artisans involved in that, but also creating lots of desks, meaning lots of jobs for Damascenes to enter into Ottoman service. Job of the Ottoman government was always prized because it gave you a regular salary and a decent pension and status. You became an effendi. You wore a tabush. You were one of the shakers and movers. So people were very keen to avail themselves of the proliferation of new jobs that came with this expansion of the government service. And along with that was a major investment in education. So the school system sees an expansion, and the first truly elite secondary establishment was opened in the 1880s in the abandoned mansion of one of the Jewish notables, Yusuf Pasha Anbar. This becomes Mektab Anbar, which is the Mektab Idadi of the sort of Ottoman higher school system. And it was just the most elite and prestigious institution Syria had ever known. Mektab Anbar would remain at the forefront of Syrian education right through the Mandate years. And so it has a special place in Syrian lore. But you could see where there were all these new investments creating tangible gains for everyone, all Damascenes, Muslim, Christian, and Jew. And it created spaces in which these communities increasingly met, because all these new government regulations gave rise to councils with elected councillors, where you had a quota from each community present. And you had cafes and theaters and public spaces, as well as these marketplaces, which meant that Muslims, Christians, and Jews were once again meeting in public in a way that they hadn't done comfortably since before the 1860 events. It was a normalizing of society in a time of growing prosperity, in which the prosperity came at the expense of no community and to the benefit of all. And that's where I would say that between the 1865 adoption of this new structure and 1888, when Beirut finally achieved separation of the control of Damascus and establishes itself as its own province of Beirut, breaking up the super province of Europe. But Damascus is by then rebuilt. It has been relaunched. Phoenix-like, it's emerged from its ashes as a bigger, more beautiful city than what it had been before the events themselves. So the reconstruction of Damascus shows how a society can be brought back from the brink of mass violence through reconstruction and reconciliation. It actually can be achieved. And I think for many who read the book today, they will see parallels in the many genocidal moments that have stained human societies in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe, in Latin America. There are such situations going on as we speak, where in Darfur, there are very real concerns that the Rapid Response Force might unleash another genocidal moment in Sudan. In Gaza, we have seen on the 7th of October an attack against Israel that many Israelis have seen as a genocidal moment, and where a complaint has been brought to the International Court of Justice on behalf of people of Gaza because of Israeli actions since the Gaza war. These are real debates that are still very much part of our society. How interesting to be able to look to a historic example, to see a pathway, to bring societies that have gone to such deep division, and to see that there is a pathway out. This example demonstrates that there's not a quick fix. So before anyone gets too optimistic that you can turn around genocidal moments at the snap of fingers, let us be sober in what our expectations are. But if we can look to an example emerging from late Ottoman history, a time when most Europeans were writing off the Ottoman Empire as a sick man on its way towards death, if they were able to achieve such a successful outcome, then surely we in the 21st century should be able to as well. I'll leave it there and we can take questions from the audience.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful lecture that was absolutely clear. I mean, really, I'm really quite enormously indebted to you, so thank you very much indeed. So, colleagues online, we'll talk a bit in the room, and then we'll gradually bring you in as well. But please get your questions ready online. And of course, there are lots of questions one could ask, but just a little one to start with. Did you find the work of Robert Hayden at all relevant to the work you were doing? He was the one that wrote a series of papers. I think the most important one was in current anthropology, when he was talking about sort of antagonistic tolerance. And his model is that communities of Muslims and Christians in the Balkans could get on quite well, sometimes for very long periods of time. Then suddenly, not necessarily with an obvious flashpoint, one of them starts massacring the other. And he said this was simply a pattern all over the area. And I thought that he absolutely hit the nail on the head. Yes, I think it was called antagonistic tolerance.
Oh, you have to send me the reference. No, dude, I don't know that work, and it sounds so germane.
Yes, I mean, he was attacked by pacifist anthropologists who said that his model had an inherently almost pessimistic view of human nature, that we like massacring each other, and therefore overlooked the other factors that might lead people to come into conflict, one of which no doubt would be asymmetrical access to economic relations or something like that. But I think his answer would be that he was only talking about the history of these places as he analysed it as an historian or as a sociological historian. He wasn't really denying, no doubt, that economy might be important. But I love this idea. You see, it also comes from Haslow's work on shared shrines, of course, which I'm sure you know very well. I mean, we've got people who are sharing the same shrine for decades. And then suddenly one day, either the priest or the imam gets massacred. It's absolutely extraordinary. And another would be the Tony Bringer's film, Being Muslim, the Bosnian Way, where you suddenly see the Croats and the Serbs and the Muslims coming into that conflict with his neighbours, suddenly refusing to speak with one another. So there we are. I mean, that kind of thing. I don't know how much you find that kind of comparison useful in your.
Well, I think it's very useful. And again, I think it serves as a way to not be able to isolate the Damascus events in Damascene society or the Lebanese events in Lebanese society. There's a tendency to try and say that there's something about these societies that's different from us. We can take comfort in the fact that those atrocities aren't going to happen in my backyard. And then you watch the breakdown of former Yugoslavia, and you realize it can happen absolutely anywhere. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of resonance. And again, Midhat Pasha coming out of the Balkans was very alerted to the threats that were plaguing Syria. And so I mean,
There's
this
a
is why I
connection
think,
there, isn't there? Yes.
yeah, it's quite interesting to see him and Fuad sit down and draft the provincial reform law.
Yes, indeed. Just for a point of clarification, you said it was different from any solution which was tried in the Lebanon. What was different about the solution that was tried? What do they do about the Druze massacre?
Yeah, it's very interesting because the Europeans intervened far more directly in Mount Lebanon in the aftermath of Damascus than they do in Damascus.
Mhm.
The Europeans create a commission allegedly to assist and advise the Sultan's government. But basically, it's to set the agenda for what the Ottomans do. And it's all damage control from Fuad Pasha's perspective from the moment they arrive, trying to preserve Ottoman sovereignty over its own lands against the extension of European influence. And so they had succumbed to European pressures in a previous restructuring of Mount Lebanon after the Egyptian withdrawal and after the collapse of the Shihabi Principality. In 1842, they create a kind of divided mountain. They separate north from south Mount Lebanon on the line of the Beirut to Damascus road before you had a highway. And the north was to be deemed a Maronite section, the south a Druze section, with kaimakams or district governors in charge of each, but they're very mixed. You know, you have Druze in the north, you have lots of Maronites in the south. So then they create councils in which Druze and Maronites and other faith communities would be represented in these kaimakamics. And the system was flawed from the outset. It only created tensions. Many would say that the breakdown in the structure of Mount Lebanon in 1859, 1860 was in part due to the flaws of this system, which had been kind of imposed on the Ottomans by the Europeans who wanted to protect Christian rights by giving them their own kaimakamlik. Okay, so they're back again after the 1860 events in Lebanon. And they want to have a decisive say in whatever structure government follows. And the Ottomans are just determined to try and draw Mount Lebanon more closely under Istanbul's rule, not have it float further away. So they come up with a kind of hybrid solution, which is called the Mutasarrifiyya. Mount Lebanon becomes a kind of independent Mutasarrifiyya, rather the way that Jerusalem was. And it is to be ruled by an Ottoman Christian, non-native to Mount Lebanon. So a Christian Ottoman from anywhere else but Mount Lebanon will be appointed as governor. And then it creates a council under the Mutasarrif with representation allocated by religious community. And the thinking is benevolent. We want to make sure that Greek Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Maronites, Jews, Druze, Shiites, Sunnis are all represented. But the downside of that is it creates rigid structures with quotas for certain posts, all decided by confessional identity. And it does work for the Mutasarrif era. I mean, Engin Akarlı has written a book called The Long Peace, which treats the period of the Mutasarrif from 1861 right up into the First World War. And really, it was a period of unprecedented communal harmony throughout Lebanon. It worked. But following that, following World War I, France will gain Lebanon as a mandate. And the precedents established for the allocation of political office by religious community is preserved. And it will give way to a confessional system in Lebanon that just doesn't work. A Lebanon that should have had a principle of citizenship, irrespective of one's religion, instead gave way to a very rigid system. The flaws of which were apparent in the first civil war of 1958, reemerged in the Beirut that I grew up in as a kid in April of 1975, was to give rise to a 15-year civil war. And I've watched the opening phases of that. And just remember how the seemingly modern, civil, secular state just gave way along religious communal lines into unbelievable blood. And so quickly. And that war would go on for 15 years. The Taif Accord that brings an end to the civil conflict and war does so only by tinkering with the structures of the confessional state. You know, equal representation of Christians and Muslims in parliament instead of a 65 ratio. The president still stays a Maronite, but you reduce the powers of the president and enhance the powers of the Sunni Muslim prime minister. You're tinkering with the formula, but it's still the same basic principle. And there's a crisis in Lebanon today. And it's impossible to make a government to address these crises. the consequences of 1860 are still very alive, and the dysfunction of government in Lebanon today. And in that, I think quite a different legacy. In Damascus, you really could say that what the Ottomans achieved after 1860, and certainly by the 1880s, would persist down to the 21st century with no confessional, no sectarian legacy. I would say until the outbreak of the civil war in 2011, in Syria's Arab Spring uprising, it's only then that you're going to see a kind of sectarianization of the Syrian population. So secular nationalist had they been for the 20th century. That has changed, but it's a long run for a successful new order that I credit the Ottomans with having achieved.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, Ollie, what would you like to ask our speaker?
Looking at what the authorities did after the massacre comes across as deliberate. And obviously we're looking back at this over a series of years, both in terms of the immediate reprisals and then the economic policy. Is that an accurate reading of it, or am the economic side seems that leads to normalization seems to some extent a consequence of telegraph and roads? Or is this all being planned centrally in Constantinople in order to bring about this normalization?
So I think that planning, if to the extent that you had a kind of long-term master plan, and that's probably unlikely, but if we were to imagine such a thing, it would have been crafted locally. What Istanbul put in place was a new governing structure that would allow for the accumulation of revenues in a way that would allow you to make significant infrastructure investment. There just wasn't enough revenue stream from within the confines of the old province of Damascus to generate prosperity. It took more. And the very fact that this province of Syria was allowed to break down, Jerusalem breaks off first, Beirut by 1888, it's allowed to sort of break down. But in the very fact that they cobbled three together to create that income stream and base it in Damascus, to me, was where Istanbul was deliberately doing something to enhance the cash flow. I don't have a document that says that. So I'm using a bit of deductive reasoning here. But as I said, they weren't committed to preserving super provinces, but they put them in place and for a purpose. And seeing both in, because the other is Midhat Pasha's record in the Tuna Vilayeti. We have very detailed accounts of how many bridges, roads, highways, communication infrastructure, markets, schools, government offices, government buildings. It's a very similar spending spree. And that, I think, reflects Istanbul's thinking that in the Balkans, as in Syria, if you didn't find a way to integrate people into the Ottoman project, they were going to break away. And that Balkanization that cost the Ottomans their European provinces could begin to play as well in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Interesting. And so does later on, when you have the tension with the Armenians that ultimately leads to massacres, is that something that perhaps, considering their experience in Damascus, they are aware of, that the tensions are rising there and it could lead to something else? Or is it a case that they haven't done that?
Well, you rightly point out that while we talk about Damascus events, that's not the end of communal tensions in the Ottoman Empire. And there are many other variables at play. I think just as we could distinguish the origins of violence in Mount Lebanon from the origins of violence in Damascus, I think you'd have to look to the specific triggers of violence in, let us say, the 6 provinces of Eastern Anatolia around the emergence of the first wave of massacres in the 1890s, when you have Armenian nationalist groups emerging, the Hunchaks, the Dashnaks, who create a political movement reminiscent of the kind of Christian cultural linguistic movements that gave rise to Bulgaria, Montenegro, Greece, as even Albania, as breakaways. There was a real fear that the Armenians were beginning to go that way. But as you know, their presence was spread so thinly, there was no province in which they were in a majority. They were a minority in virtually every province they lived. But the tension is there, and we see, horrific massacres, much more dramatic in their numbers in the 1890s in Eastern Anatolia, with the Hamidiya cavalry being involved and the Kurds being involved, and, then Ottoman in 1909, massive numbers, much bigger than Damascus, but quite different context in the 1890s Eastern Anatolia. And then, of course, in the course of the First World War, the genocide against Armenians and Assyrians, which, though very controversial still in Turkish circles, increasingly Turkish scholars are documenting. It becomes harder and harder not to talk about genocide during the war. I would say that the genocidal moment is going to be a feature of the tensions that emerge in specific contexts, each one of them unique, each one of them particular. But certainly as part of the challenges to community in the Ottoman Empire and territorial integrity, which will reappear in many other places.
Just a more detailed point. How long did it take the news of the outbreak of the massacre to reach whether it was the telegraph already in existence? And how long did it take for Russia to get to the city?
I give the dates in the book, and I will get the dates wrong in my head. I would say it was a matter of 3 or 4 days for word of the events to get to Constantinople. And from there, it was telegraphed to European capitals. So the first reports we get are about 7 days after the events in London or Paris. Fuad is already being appointed to take on the job at that point, and I think he's off a week later. So I would say with 2 weeks of the crisis of, I guess, the fall of Zahli would be the trigger, but already it had been building, because it's only after he's left Istanbul that he gets word of the violence in Damascus. So he arrives in Beirut. Damascus is happening between when he left Istanbul and when he arrives in Beirut, and he realizes that his mission is now going to be doubled. That he's going to have to restore authority over Mount Lebanon, which in itself was a different case. It was not an Ottoman province in the same way. Damascus, in many ways, is much more serious for the Ottomans because it is a very important provincial capital. It would be like having Bursa go on, or any of the major, Erzurum or something, a major capital of a major province. This is one of the biggest cities in the Arab provinces. So I think for Fuad, Damascus was even more acute than Mount Lebanon. But yeah, it's that kind of time scale.
And how long was it from the massacre to his arrival starting to take?
So the massacre breaks out in Damascus on the 8th of July. And I guess the Ottomans managed to send a replacement governor 8 days after that. But like his predecessor, he hides in the governor's palace because he is afraid of the mob. He does not have the confidence to impose his authority. And to be fair to him, he didn't come with any sort of forces with him. He had no law and order. Fuad made a point. He delayed his arrival in Damascus. He waited in Beirut until he had, I think it was a force of 4,000 or 6,000 soldiers that accompanied him from Beirut to Damascus. And they just put a cordon in. So the first way to impress the Damascenes that the Ottomans are back, and there's no fooling around, is with Fuad's arrival.
That was about what date?
I would say that it's the end of July, beginning of August. So there was definitely a delay there. But the dates are in the book. I should have a better grasp. I could do what done here. I can do.
Yeah, the other terrifying aspect of the events which you described was the acute sexual violence, particularly the targeting girls and young women, which is something news to me. There's that, and was the question where were the Ottomans? Obviously, the governor you say this went over. But what sort of garrison did the Ottomans have?
That's a really good question. The governor Ahmed Pasha, the one who was later executed, I found one report by him. He seemed to be in a delusional state. It's actually quite a good report for our purposes, just to show the way in which he was in denial about the gravity of the situation unfolding. But his first response was always to blame the central government for drawing down the garrison in Damascus to serve in the Balkans. They were taking troops from Damascus, posting them away from Syria, and he was complaining to the Sublime Porte that he was left understrength and did not have enough troops, regular, trustworthy troops, to provide the security. So he was forced to recruit irregulars. This is where the Bashabazuks come into the story, to try and make up the shortfall. And they were not. Many of them lost discipline, got involved in the violence. And in terms of the accounts of sexual violence, I mean, again, it's just one of those things that is repeated in all the sources. It's repeated in different ways. For many of the Christian chroniclers, as is the case in every society, sexual violence is just so devastating that they don't even like to use the word. They wouldn't use the word rape. They would talk about the evil act or the ugly act. You know, how many the ugly acts were performed. They would say that a group of soldiers took a woman and that she died under the ugly act, meaning that they gang raped her and she died. So this isn't just sort of atrocity form. This is part of the historical record, and it would be an injustice not to bring it in. It also is part of, there's a moment in that chapter, which you will have read, where I just said, what has just happened? And as you go through the chronicle of the crimes committed, it really does conform with so many of the crimes against humanity we associate with genocide. So, in the Bosnian Serbian conflict, the use of rape as an act of war, violence, was widely chronicled, and then becomes part of a critique of genocide. This is there are 400 women believed to have been taken into households and forced impregnated. So they would have been violated until they were pregnant. And in that way, you turn a woman's body against her own community because all children they bear would, of course, be Muslim. The taking of children into Muslim households was another way to make them disappear as Christians. You didn't have to the only people they seemed to be actively killing were teenage boys through middle-aged men. Old men and young children, by and large, weren't harmed. And in this way, if you could kill the men, absorb the women into households, have women bear Muslim children, adopt Christian children into Muslim, Christians disappear. It's genocide. And so that's why, and because the sources are quite detailed on these acts, and in some cases we have, of the Christian boys taken away, they all came home circumcised. So the intention was very clearly to raise them as Muslims. And there was even a theological argument. Again, I love the detail that comes through the sources, which Damascenes, like many of their contemporaries, maintained that all are born Muslim. And it's only when you reach maturity and adhere to the faith of your parents, Christian or Jewish, that you depart from the fold of Muslims. So any child who has not reached maturity is a Muslim. And so there's no crime or violence being done to them to raise them as what they are. In a sense, it's their parents that make them deviate from what they should be. So for Damascenes, these ways you could really envisage murder is part of it, but there are all these other pathways to make the Christians disappear. And it's in that context where, and it also just to remind ourselves that this is urban violence as we've known it in any other context, whether it's China, India, or Yugoslavia, or El Salvador. This is what happens when society breaks down. And even in a pious and conservative city like Damascus, you will have such acts. So yeah, it emerges as a real place. Once in a while.
It sounds like you had quite an interesting time digging into the archives. this. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about the sources?
It was a huge part of the fun of this book. And it starts, as those of you who've read the opening of the book know, in the American archives, where I was a doctoral student back in 1989. I've been waiting for this book to come out since 1989, where I was consulting consular records from Damascus and Jerusalem for whatever insights they might give on Transjordan, which is what I was writing. So I was, in a sense, just sort of touching base to see if there was anything that would crop up of relevance to my research. I'd been doing that in French and British archives. Made sense I'd do it in America. And I knew that the first American vice consul was Mikhail Mishapa, who was my main character. He's a very well-known intellectual today, wrote tons of books, including a great history of Syria and Lebanon in the 18th and 19th century, in Arabic called Al-Jawab al-Iqtirah al-Ahbab, the response to the suggestion of the loved ones. It came out in English translation by Harvard scholar Wheeler Thaxton in 1987 under the sensational title Murder, Mayhem, Pillage, and Plunder, which does kind of capture the groove of what was going on in Syria and Lebanon in the 18th and 19th century. So I was so keen to read his reports. And when I got to the archive and called them up, they couldn't find them. The first 3 volumes, they couldn't find it. They could confirm that no one else had them. The Damascus registers weren't used all that much, so no, it wasn't somewhere else. Why didn't I go make an appointment with the archivist and go into the stacks? Which, by the way, if ever you get a shop to go into the stacks in the American Archive, do it. It's a cathedral of historic wealth. And so I was hugely influenced. And what had happened was Mishaka had kept his early correspondence in just locally sourced notebooks, and not in the standard issue consular registers that American missions used. From volume 4 onward, that's what you get. But these first 3, which would have been repatriated from Damascus to America, probably in the mid-20th century, imagine the 1950s, had come in with all those Damascus volumes because they're all in Arabic. There's not a word in English to tell an American archivist what they contained. They just sort of stacked them on a shelf and no one knew what they were. So I had that wonderful moment of discovery. I was the first researcher to lay hold of this material, and I instantly knew because he was appointed in September of 1859. So I would get, 9 months of the descent to hell, and then a full decade of his reports after the events. I was sitting on the most important news source on this very important turning point in Middle Eastern history. And so I knew when I was done with my thesis, get my doctorate in, publish the doctorate, this is going to be my next book. I got there eventually. And in the course of my work, I went back to Damascus and worked in the Markaz and Matarik al-Tarikhiyya in Switzerland. Spent the days walking the old quarter where all this happened, and had my research interrupted by the attacks of 9/11. Decided to leave Damascus while I could. Went to Istanbul and worked in the Başbakanlık, as it was then known, to work through the Ottoman sources, which is where I got all of Fuat Pasha's reports and whatnot. And one report from Ahmed Pasha. Went to Beirut to go work among the manuscript sources at the American University Library. So no, the archival research was a huge part of the fun. And I kept putting this project down to write other books. I wrote the Arabs, the Ottomans. And once that was out, I was like, no, I really want to write this one. I don't want to keep putting this off. It'll never happen. And so I'm so glad I did. I had all the material. I just needed the time to sit and write. And what made this book different from the previous ones was that rich archival material. But these characters, I have very strong characters that stay with you right through the book. And they knew each other. They reference each other. You can imagine nodding to each other as they pass in the streets of Damascus. And I've never written a book that was peopled by such strong characters before. It almost felt like writing a novel. Mm-hmm. And that was really the joy for me of writing this book. I really had, it sounds terrible to say you have fun writing a book about massacre, but I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Should we take some questions from?
Yeah.
We should, yes.
Any questions online?
Absolutely.
Please make yourselves available.
Just put your hand up if you'd like to ask a
Just
question.
jump in.
Don't know how many colleagues there are on it.
There are only 7 left.
You might have a look at the chat and see whether anybody posted any questions.
Well, the one who just left earlier, asking about sources, so perhaps you can provide me with a book listing, and then I can go on the website.
With pleasure.
Yeah, so that's could be a solution.
Can I ask one question? You mentioned about the other good parts, right? And after these kind of, issues, I really picked up on the activity that you mentioned about the educational, within Damascus, and I'm totally unaware of it. But I'm wondering, do you have any information around what happened to that Macbeth, and is that building still there? Has that survived, or is there a legacy within the society we know right now?
Excellent question. And yeah, the school was to prove influential right through the Mandate years. And it becomes a real school of nationalists. And one of the notables of Damascus who attended, a man named Zafar al-Qasimi, has written a history of Maktab Anbar, which really focuses on its 20th century history. So it doesn't help me very much with my 19th century work, but among famous Damascene nationalists who were graduates of the school, Fakhri al-Barudi has written a very long memoir, Muzakarat, and he has a very long and detailed description of his school experiences, kind of inflected with mid-20th century sensibilities of Arab nationalism. There's a tendency to project backwards resentments or hostilities against the Turks or the Ottomans that were more particular to the 20th and to the 19th century. And to counter those, in my own research in Jordan for my doctorate, I was given a memoir by a graduate of Maktab Anbar, who would have been in one of the first classes. He was a country boy from a village in the north of Jordan, and he talks about his education experience, how he was recruited by the local Makam, and goes on up to Damascus to check it out. And everyone's like, what? They're offering you a scholarship to come here? Of course you're gonna come. This is like the most amazing, prestigious place. We're all trying to get our children in. And so he begins to think, oh, maybe this is something I should do. And he goes and does the test. And it's really, it's great because, he'd done Ibtidai school in his village. He learned some basic Turkish, but like a lot of people in the Arab provinces, they didn't take to Turkish easily. And so the interview for Maktab Anbar was all done in Turkish. And he writes it in his memoir in Arabic. He captures even the questions they ask in Turkish, and he talks about how he didn't understand, and how the interview went, and that he was admitted, given his scholarship, and he loved the school. He loved the clothes, he loved the food, he loved the education. But he also describes things that are very sort of common to schoolboy memoirs about, he was a mature student, so he was already about 18 when he went. He liked to smoke. So he'd go into the bathrooms to smoke. And then if the teachers would catch them, they'd have to flush their tobacco down the toilet. But like all the bad boys would go behind the toilets to go smoke. How like our time, so, And he even captures a kind of pedophile scandal of one of the teachers who is clearly stroking one of the boys in a way that makes the others uncomfortable. And our chronicler detects Raka on his breath. And so it's alcohol, it's sex, it's boys. And so a group of them complain, and apparently it goes right up to, Yildiz palace, because they get a decision back from, Yildiz with basically the guilty parties dismissed, the virtuous schoolboys who had denounced him voted, and it's all part of this story. Why does that matter? Because it's a little bit about the way in which one felt absorbed into or integrated into this Ottoman system. And for Saleh al-Tan, it made him love the Ottoman system. He loved learning Turkish. He would be with a group of his fellow Turkophile years later, into old age. They'd sit in a corner of the cafe and chat to each other in Turkish, just to be different. The way I imagine Etonians talking to each other in Latin or something, just to like stand out from the crowd. So it worked in really providing the draw of a very prestigious school, an experience that was very positive and reinforcing, and then a doorway to good government jobs with recognition and prestige and all that. I mean, I think as a part of this story, it's a very important role of education. The school building survives. Most of the places I talk about from the post-Reconstruction phase are still there. For all the destruction visited on Syria, central Damascus has not been hit. Unlike, let's say, Aleppo or,
Inside the wall,
The
inside.
walled city, it's the suburbs of Damascus, the distant suburbs, the modern suburbs that have suffered violence. But the historic center is still preserved, and one hopes that it will always be preserved for such a time when good government returns to Syria. And, the readers of this book will be able to visit the city where all of this unfolded. It is still, I imagine, and I haven't been back since 2010, a magical city that, with its thousands of years of history, we should all be keen to preserve for all posterity.
Thank you.
So did you have a sense, it's implied in your talk, that the pupils of the school were drawn from all the different communities?
That I don't know. It's funny, I don't have student lists. And if anything, what the Ottomans were trying to do was to balance out the strength of Christian schools or missionary schools in Damascus that already were providing the kind of multidisciplinary education, not just religion and history and literacy, but geometry, geography, languages, a multidisciplinary education that prepares you for professional life. A lot of Christian schools were doing that. A lot of Muslim kids were being drawn into those schools. And if you like, the highest level until you had Mekteb Anbar was the Rushdiye schools. And Rushdiye schools were, in many ways, a failing middle school system. They weren't quite a high school. They were more than a primary school. They were meant to give a kind of state curriculum, but they were largely staffed by religious scholars because that was really the only stock of teachers they could draw upon. And so the Rushdiya schools were not really able to compete with European funded or Christian run schools. And so it's not until you get Mekteb Anbar, the opening of an actual Idadi school, because the Idadi school system was like the peak of the peak. And my young village guy said, degree from the Mekteb Anbar was viewed the way a doctorate is today. So he was really proud to get his diploma. And he felt that that was a mark of distinction in the Ottoman system, recognized university. Idadi graduate.
No, I can well believe. Of course, we've got the same phenomenon in Turkey today. Galata Lise graduates and so on. But when they tried to become civil servants, were they taking multi-confessional people to be in the civil service, do you think, as part of the rebuilding?
This is what I don't know. It would take research into different kinds of sources than I was reading to write this book.
Yeah.
So there are good records
Mhm.
for the appointments of people.
Right. So from the names, it might be clear, obviously, if one could.
Names help, but they're also very good, when they give identities of people.
All right.
The profiles, it almost reads like a LinkedIn CV or something. I mean, it's so there would be sources to talk a bit about, who is getting appointed. But certainly at the level of elected councils, like I said, we know that if you were on the legal council that would sit in on court hearings, there had to be like 2 Christians on there, 1 Jew, so 9 Muslims. These were quotas, but it did mean that in these public bodies, there was a mixing of the communities that meant that they were working together towards common goals, and not necessarily to try and advance the aims of one or the interests of one community at the expense of another. That's a really pernicious, the zero-sum game.
Quite. And your talk shows once more just how important these 2 men were. Mithat Pasha and Iqbal, absolutely astonishing in their role in the 19th century.
It's so impressive. Real
Yes.
real statesman.
So,
Yeah.
with good links with the external world as well.
Yeah.
Yes. But any more questions? You want to ask anything?
And we have kept your audience going for an hour and 3/4. Isn't it? Very patient.
A last chance for any questions from the online audience, please.
Yeah.
I think that's it.
I think, well, we've been truly enlightened this evening. What more can we say? We've been absolutely enlightened. So thank you very much.
Thank you.